everyone. My name is Francesca Barbini and I'm the owner of Luna Press Publishing. Today I am here with Jane Alexander and we're going to be talking about Jane's incoming collection, The Flicker Against the Light and Writing the Contemporary Uncanny. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Francesca. I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. And now, given the situation, although Jane and I are not too physically distant from each other within Edinburgh, we still are using Zoom technology, of course, because it makes our life easier in a sense. And technology features really highly in all of Jane's work, in a way that it shows you how technology has made our lives easier, but at the same time, it has caused some issues as well. So we're going to be exploring a lot of different topics today. So the first thing I would like to say, of course, is how Jane came into the Luna family. So the first time we spoke, it was a few years back, actually, and we were discussing already Jane's idea of a collection on the uncanny. Now, at the same time, there was another project on the go, edited by Pippa Goldschmidt, Jill Haddo, and Fadila Mazanderani, which was called Uncanny Bodies. Now, that project was exploring the uncanny, both in short fiction and in academic papers related to the short fiction, and of course applied to the human body. And Jane had a beautiful story in there called The Lag. So after the book then took its life and left the coop, as it were, and was unleashed onto the world with beautiful results, Jane and I were able to start discussing the collection, The Flicker Against the Light. So it is on this book that we're going to be focusing today, and I guess I would like to invite Jane to tell us a bit about this collection and how it came to be, specifically because it's not a simple, straightforward collection. It is one of the hybrids that we love to do at Accademia Lunare, which has both fiction and non-fiction into one. So Jane, over to you.
Yeah, so that kind of hybrid form has been integral to the book, really, from its kind of first conception. So I started working on these stories as part of a PhD that I did in creative writing at Northumbria University. And as part of that PhD, I also produced a critical, reflexive kind of a piece of writing as well that engaged with my stories, but also with lots of other kinds of writers working in that territory, and lots of kind of critical theorists of the uncanny and technology and so on. And so right from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to write a collection of stories that were kind of unsettling, that offered illuminating and uneasy kind of perspectives on our experiences of technology. So some quite everyday kind of technologies. So things to do with, data surveillance of the kind that, we're all very accustomed to now in our phones and online and so on. Communications technologies as well, of the kind that, again, particularly in the current circumstances, we're very, very familiar with, and also some more kind of near future scenarios to do with biomedicine, biotechnologies, and so on. And I wanted these stories to be kind of uncanny in themselves, and also as a whole kind of collection of stories. So I really wanted to kind of make use of that form of a short story collection to be constantly doing something slightly different, and constantly sort of slightly pulling the rug out from under the reader, and the kind of the critical essay that accompanies the stories, I think, is my way of kind of investigating what it means to be trying to write uncanny fiction now. So the uncanny, it's as a kind of an experience. It's been with us for a very long time, but famously conceptualized by Freud in 1919, so just over 100 years ago. And some of its tropes perhaps are a little overfamiliar to us now. So there was a real kind of question for me about how you manage to write something that has an uncanny effect in today's for today's readers who are perhaps, they've seen a lot, they kind of have expectations of how a particular story will kind of pan out, and is there a way to kind of reinvent tropes, bring new tropes in, or recontextualize tropes so that they retain or regain some of their uncanny effect.
Absolutely. I think, especially now, like you said, we're getting closer and closer to that very fine line between that certainty and the uncanny, and turning into uncanny. Absolutely. So thank you for that, Jane. So I love the stories, and I found them incredibly unsettling. I loved a lot of things about them to begin with. For example, I love the fact that most of them are set in Edinburgh, and for me, having lived here for over 20 years, it felt so familiar, which is such a nice thing. When you, I suppose, when you, like me, come from another city in another country, and then move here, so the fact that I could recognize them, yeah, it was very special to me. Also, like I said, that there is that sense of, I love that bit of technology. That sounds something I would love, and at the same time, as you read, you think, maybe not. But it was so fascinating. There was You were able to touch on a lot of issues in these stories that affect the life of an individual every day, and also I loved the way that you touched on emotions and of the feelings that these people were experiencing in their stories. So let's stay with the stories for a moment. Would you like to focus a little bit on them, and maybe tell us anything you like, including, for example, if you had a favorite, or what was it, or how did you find the technology for each of the stories? Did you start from a feeling and you associated that technology, or invented that technology for it, or how did that process essentially worked, yeah, for you?
Yeah, it was so interesting. I mean, it was probably slightly different for each story. The first story that I consciously wrote for this collection, although it's not the earliest story that has ended up being included, was Candlemaker Row, and that's a story about a virtual reconstruction of Edinburgh following the destruction of the city in some kind of unspecified disaster, and it's narrated from the perspective of a technologist of smells who is tasked with recreating the various different kind of smells that you would encounter walking through the city. And actually, I wrote that story without intending it to be an uncanny story, and without actually intending it necessarily to really be about technology. What I wanted to do was to write a story about Edinburgh. I had seen a competition with a call for submissions, and the brief was to write a story about Edinburgh that had a link to some kind of a map. And I'd been to a degree show at the art college, and somebody there had created a smell map of Edinburgh, like an actual kind of physical smell map of Edinburgh. And I thought this was so amazing. And it came back to me when I was trying to think my way into how to write about Edinburgh, because I found it very, very hard to do. I think because Edinburgh has been so written about, it felt very difficult to find a fresh way to write about it. And so then that solution of kind of just raising it to the ground and literally kind of recreating it it kind of, that was my way in, really. But what was so interesting about that was because by this stage I had already been reading a lot of uncanny fiction and reading a lot of kind of theory about the uncanny and so on, and all of that obviously kind of just seeped in, and the result was a story that is really, really uncanny in all sorts of ways. Confusions between real and not real, the suggestion of haunting. These kinds of things are really kind of fundamental to that story. And so once I realized that without trying to, I had kind of written an uncanny short story, that I think that gave me the idea that I could approach all of the stories in a slightly less schematic way than I might otherwise have done. So sort of trusting that because of the reading that I was doing, because of everything that I was kind of steeped in at that time, the uncanniness would kind of emerge from within, and it would kind of guide the stories. And then later on, I could go back to them and I could kind of think about to what extent each story was working in an uncanny way, and changes that I might need to make, rewriting that I might need to do in order to just kind of push them in that unsettling direction.
Tell me, is there a particular piece of technology that you've come up with or that you've elaborated on that you wouldn't mind having for real for yourself?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think perhaps so. One of the later stories that I wrote was a kind of at a certain point when I was writing these stories. So one of the risks with writing a short story collection, I think, is that you can end up slightly doing the same thing over and over again. You know, you've written a short story, it kind of works, and so you sort of use those techniques in the next one and the next one. And particularly in a collection of short fiction that's supposed to be constantly unsettling the reader, that's a huge problem, because if the reader learns what to expect, learns your tricks in a way, then it's no longer unsettling for them. So I had to keep kind of pushing and pushing, and sort of trying out different things. And so one of the stories that I wrote quite late on was quite a short piece called Small Objects. And this is a story about somebody who is left a memory by their father when he passes away. And the memories are described as a kind of a cricket ball sized spherical object, but not really described in any more detail than that. But there's a kind of suggestion that you can somehow, you can make a decision to open up and access these memories. And I think that would be a very beautiful thing. So you can really kind of fully experience just a brief kind of a moment or an instant, an episode from somebody else's life. I think that could be fabulous.
Yes, absolutely. Oh no, it's true actually. You know, when obviously you can use it in so many different ways in a story. But yes, if you thought about reality, especially I suppose with a human being aging and forgetting, it would be so beautiful if you were able to actually have the ability
Yeah,
to do that and leave that as part of in your will, I suppose, to your hair or something, or
yeah,
just as a gift to a friend, it'd be so beautiful.
absolutely.
I like that very much.
Yeah, and there's something about it being an object as well that I think is quite important in that regard. So, I've read kind of fiction where it's possible to kind of access somebody else's memories or share somebody else's memories or experience somebody else's life. But there's something about being able to give an object and being able to own an object and perhaps put an object on display that also is a memory. I think that is quite kind of significant.
Absolutely. No, I like that very much. So I know this is possibly one of the hardest questions to ask an author, but I'm gonna try. Is there
Okay.
a favorite story?
Oh, it is really hard. There are so Small Objects is one uh, that still for me when I read it has a kind of an emotional payoff. Even though I've read it a lot of times, and there are a couple of others that kind of do that still for me within the collection. I think it's not necessarily always the stories that I think, oh, I did the best job there, that feel to me the most kind of perfectly achieved story that I could write, but it's the stories that manage to retain that kind of emotional payoff. So there's one called Blood, which is about a young man donating his blood plasma to rejuvenate an older generation of people, and that's really a story about kind of exploitation and kind of ambiguous personal and family relationships. And then there's one called Flesh of Their Flesh, which is about the daughter of a man who receives an organ transplant from a pig, and that explores the extent to which one might kind of open oneself up to something more animal,
Yep.
kind of a generosity of kind of expanding the sense of what it can mean to be human. And I think those stories are the ones that kind of still for me resonate.
Yes, absolutely. Let's talk about the uncanny essay now, writing the contemporary uncanny. So, tell us about building that essay and your research into Freud's uncanny.
Yeah, so that was absolutely the first starting point, and I think it has to be the starting point for any critical writing about the uncanny. And it was for me, it was something that really evolved in directions that I didn't necessarily expect it to go. So again, I was writing a much longer kind of a critical piece of writing about the uncanny as part of this PhD thesis. And one of the things that I was trying to do there was to really let the essay be informed by my creative practice, but also then to let the creative practice be informed by the essay and the critical thinking as well. And there were some things that emerged to me about a contemporary version of the uncanny that I think, I couldn't have got to in any other way other than writing this essay alongside writing the uncanny short fiction. So, for instance, there's a notion that I talk about in the essay of an uncanny of the virtual gaze. So, to be surveilled is, or to be to be watched by an all-seeing intelligence is one of the tropes of the uncanny that Freud talks about in his essay. And it's really interesting to me to consider, how that works in a society where very often we're being surveilled, but not by a person, not by a human, not by any kind of an intelligence, but by data collection, by algorithms, those kinds of things. And so what does that mean for us? How does it affect our sense of ourselves? Um, and and that was something that I noticed kind of coming through in my stories, and very often kind of coinciding with, so the double again is a really kind of classic, the doppelganger, a classic trope of the uncanny that Freud talks about. But I found in my stories that I was tending to work with not just with doubles but with multiples, and those things tended to kind of coalesce together. This, the kind of idea of surveillance and also of kind of repetition and multiples and so on. And so those were things that I was then able to kind of explore more critically in the essay and look at in terms of other people's fiction as well as kind of theorists of the uncanny.
Interestingly, as we are recording this, I am in the process of editing our latest call for paper on world building. And actually, in my introduction in this book, I did mention both uncanny bodies and the flicker against the light. Because as I was reading these papers, the one also obviously that made the final version of the call for papers, and as I was reading them, I realized that in a lot of their process in explaining world building or analyzing world building in other people, the concept of the uncanny was keep coming back over and over again. It's so interesting in the way that we try to recreate world, even in fiction, science fiction, fantasy. We try to recreate worlds, but at the same time shift them off kilter from the reality layer, and that produces a sense of uncanny to a certain extent, especially in speculative fiction, I would say, and so that was something very interesting that I was finding, and that's why I ended up thinking about both your book and, of course, the uncanny bodies that came out last year. So yes, uncanny, I think it's very present in our subconscious, I guess. Freud would be in agreement with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are all these kinds of so one of the things that I think uncanny fiction, but also all different kinds of uncanny art forms do perhaps is to unsettle a sense of personal identity, a sense of self, um, and we're experiencing so many kind of disembodiments and like decenterings of self. And here I am talking to you on Zoom, and I know where you are physically, and I know where I am physically, but we're in this space which is not a physical space, and we have almost like multiple selves existing, kind of talking to each other in this cyberspace, and so experiences like that, they really demand the uncanny to be kind of brought to them as a kind of a tool for kind of examining those experiences. I think the uncanny is like a really it's an incredibly kind of valuable tool for this kind of moment, and it has been since the kind of the 90s really, or even slightly earlier, but it kind of, after Freud wrote his essay, it sort of it wasn't really kind of picked up on particularly by other kind of theorists until there was kind of a flurry of interest in it, kind of like the 60s and 70s. But by the 90s, it was really kind of spreading into all different kinds of disciplines, all different ways of thinking, and it just hasn't really gone away. And I think that's because it's so incredibly useful for kind of excavating our experiences at this present time. These kind of technologically saturated experiences that we're having.
So Jane has already started her publishing career with a very, very interesting book, A User's Guide to Make Believe. And I actually got my copy, my signed copy, in Waterstone when Jane did the book launch. I think it feels like, I don't know, over a year and a half. I mean, it was pre-pandemic for sure.
It was just before the pandemic, just before lockdown. So yeah.
It's like, it's incredible. But so Jane, obviously you have the skills in writing long form, of course, because that was a novel, and you're also very skilled with your short story. So from your perspective, how do you find the two format? What do you think are the differences from an author point of view, in approaching those two formats, a novel and a short story? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean they both offer such completely different things. For me, they're really, really very, very different forms to work in. And I know not every writer kind of feels like this, but it's almost as different as, like fiction and poetry, for instance.
Yeah.
So with short stories, I feel that you're constantly kind of reinventing everything each time you begin a new short story. And there's something about being able to complete a story. I mean, I'm a slow writer. When I say complete a story quickly, I don't mean in a few hours. It will be weeks. Sometimes it will be months. But there's something about knowing that it's a less sustained kind of a investment of labor in a way that allows me personally to be more experimental with it. And so that's, I think, the thing that I enjoy most about the short story form is that I feel able to kind of take it in more different directions than I would necessarily do with a novel. With a novel, though, what I love so much is just once you've begun it and you have a sense of the shape of it and you're really immersed in it, and it just kind of takes over everything, and you can just kind of live inside it for as long as it takes to write it and to rewrite it. And again, I'm a slow writer, so that can be a period of years. So they offer really different kinds of things for me. But so one of the things that is quite interesting. So I worked on A User's Guide to Make Believe at the same time as I was working on these short stories, and I think A User's Guide to Make Believe had certain kind of the story had certain kinds of expectations almost built into it about how it could develop, and with the short stories, those expectations were not always easy to evade, but they were sometimes slightly easier to kind of play around with.
Since you are on this topic, as you know, we do novella submissions. So I started to plan our novellas in 2019 because, of course, we needed to be ready for the open submission windows throughout 2020. And our first 6 novella in the Luna Novella series came out in February. And as we speak, I am currently going through the latest submission window, which was last weekend. And I'm not gonna say the number, all that we are in 3-digit number.
Oh, wow.
I will never leave this house ever again. but the interesting things, right, is that I love novellas, and particularly I think since the pandemic, it has created a very nice medium in terms of how much I can cope with attention span wise, and I found this even looking on Twitter, there are so many conversations about novellas in that sense, and I think people do always have a bit of a fond a relationship with novellas, because in a sense I see them as what used to be the writing back then. That's how most people started, Dickens, etc. But one of the things that I think a lot of authors are struggling with is to actually understand what a novella should look like or should sound
Mm.
like. And one of the major mistakes, I suppose, is people who send something that is more akin to a summary of a novel,
Yeah.
as opposed to a more in-depth, not a short story, if you see what I mean. So do you have any thoughts on novellas, any tips perhaps, or?
Yeah, so interestingly, the novella is the one form that I haven't really ever
Okay,
tried
okay.
myself. But I teach at Edinburgh University. I teach creative writing there, and many of my students write novellas, and particularly they have a dissertation that they write, which is to be between 15 and 20,000 words. And the students who are working and writing a standalone piece of fiction up to that 20,000 word length, they're writing novellas. um, I think I think you can either approach a novella as a kind of an expanded short story or as a very compressed novel. But that if you do approach it as a really compressed, tight novel, the way to do that is not to summarize what would otherwise be a standard length novel. The way to do it is to strip out everything that is at all extraneous. I mean, you don't have room for subplots. You have room for, a reasonably small cast of characters. You can follow, the journey of one person in one particular kind of moment in their life. And you can do that in a lot more depth than you could do in a 3 to 5,000 word short story, of course. But I think it's possible to approach it in either way, but that you have to make a decision one way or the other.
Absolutely. Oh, that's very good. And the moment you decide to start on a novella, excellent. Ah, that is fabulous. Thank you very much. So thank you, Jane. Tell me, before we conclude today's little mini pre-book launch session, are you working on something at the moment, something perhaps that you can share with our viewers?
Yeah, so my next project is something that's still, I've been thinking about it for quite a while, but despite that, it's still in the very early stages. It's a novel. It's absolutely extending that kind of interest in the uncanny, which I've been working with for so long in the short form, more consciously into that kind of novel length form. And it's going to be set in Edinburgh. It's going to have multiple timelines. It's going to have multiple perspectives. And other than that, it's still quite kind of inchoate, but I'm really
Absolutely.
hoping to kind of develop it a little bit more over this summer and really get on with that soon.
Fantastic. Jane's book, The Flicker Against the Light and Writing the Contemporary Uncanny, will be out on the 1st of June. Pre-orders are open from today, so you can also find the book discounted in our store. And the very good thing is that we have Chimera coming up, the online festival for fantasy and science fiction based in Edinburgh. Again, this year we're going to be online, but Jane is going to be on the program, and you will find Jane at 4:15 on the 4th of June, together with Louise Carey and Paul Braddon on a panel together. So I hope you can make Chimera, and I hope you can see Jane again in that occasion. But in the meantime, it's been lovely having you here virtually and having a wee chat with you about this fantastic collection. And I really hope to restart our lovely meetings in Edinburgh with all the Luna family as soon as possible. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being with us, Jane.
Thank you, Francesca. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you for watching. See you soon.